Thank you so much, Dale, for that nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here to speak. I'm pleased to see my Senate colleague, Senator Judith Zaffirini, here with us today. And I want to add my congratulations to those who received the Gavel Awards. As the introductions were being read and the recognitions were being read about the work that those journalists engaged in, I couldn't help but think about how much energy, how much intellect, how much work went into the stories that were written and that were acknowledged in those awards today. So thank you for the role that you're playing in making sure that our government is open, which of course assures that it is also good. I also want to thank everyone in the room for your hard work over the past year and for your commitment to ensuring that a responsible, free press continues to be a partner in serving the public good. I don't have to tell you how fast news spreads these days. Twitter alone has changed the face of how the public gets its information. Texans can get news about a rally in Egypt almost as quickly as they can about a yard sale down the street. And yes, print media has changed dramatically too. And as we were reminded this week with the purchase of the Washington Post, the traditional structure and formula of a news outlet can shift with a single and fairly simple transaction. No one knows more than you do what it means to take on ever-increasing daily challenges with less. You've taken on more assignments with less, you cover more issues with less, and at the same time, you continue to strive to remain fair and impartial. And indeed, it's been a very eventful year for the Texas media. For example, news outlets broke a story that millions in taxpayer dollars had been inappropriately granted by the Cancer Prevention and Research Institute of Texas. These grants were given to friends and cronies of current state leaders with very little accountability or oversight. This apparent lack of governance and evident self-dealing was one of the state's biggest scandals in memory. A number of scientists, including 2 Nobel Prize winners, quit their critical work as a consequence of what was happening there. As it stands now, the reputation of a publicly supported organization tasked to find a cure for cancer and improve the lives of thousands of Texans has been tarnished. And an opportunity for our state to take a national lead on such a critical issue was temporarily placed on hold. In part because of this coverage, the legislature passed a number of reforms regarding the oversight and operation of CPRIT. I was very pleased to work with Chairman Nelson, who essentially folded a bill that I had written for CPRIT accountability and transparency reforms into a bill that she wrote and worked on with Chairman Keffer. And also, I was very pleased to sponsor a bill that required that any nonprofit organization established to support CPRIT now also be open to record review. And that new statute, both of those statutes, are now in force. The past several months have been eye-opening in many other ways as well. In many ways, it matters less that the news that people are receiving is right, just so long as it's first. And to quote Edward R. Murrow in that regard, he said, "The speed of communications is wondrous to behold. It is also true that speed can multiply the distribution of information that we know to be untrue." After the past several months, I fully understand that the speed in which the public collects, absorbs, and transfers information doesn't always mean that it will be accurate. While instant news sources are exciting and bold, this shift has set what might and could be a dangerous precedent for would-be journalists who think they're reporting facts when they use their iPhones or other handheld devices to send out a tweet in which, in just 140 characters, they purport to tell the whole story, the whole truth. What should concern us all is that if it's inaccurately portrayed, this story can be, and often is, retweeted multiple times until sometimes we actually see it above the fold in the newspaper on the following day. It's up to journalists like you, of course, to strike a balance between keeping up with the times and sticking to a code of ethical journalism, a code that I know is still held in tremendously high regard in your industry. As you well know, this type of unbiased and accurate reporting depends on your ability to ask informed questions of leaders in your government and to be able to be provided access to primary sources. The relationship between the press and the government requires that government be open, clear, and comprehensive in its approach to communication in order to truly protect the public good and to forge a real partnership. I am honored to serve as the vice chair of the Senate Open Government Committee. From that post, I see aggressive oversight, transparency, and accountability as keystones, not just for responsible government, but for our society. The power of information and the power of an informed public shaped the mindset, of course, of our founding fathers and fueled a revolution based on the promise and the premise of equality. But in a state like Texas, where one party controls every major arm of government, this type of honest reporting can be extremely challenging. The most disappointing opportunities lost during this session relate to bills that I and others authored to try to shed some light on the previously undisclosed conduct of elected officials. One bill that I filed, for example, would have provided details to the public on contracts between office holders and local governments. Another would have improved accessibility and take the logical next step to centralizing the reporting of information at the Texas Ethics Commission. I also filed a bill that would have made the revolving door of lobbying by people who leave the governor's office less easy to swing open, adding financial disclosure requirements and prohibiting political contributions to office holders and candidates from people who have bids pending with agencies that are tasked with decision-making that would impact the bidders' interests. In fact, if we had gotten very serious, if we had truly done our job this session, state legislators had a chance to vote on and could have stopped former appointed board members and heads of state agencies for lobbying for 2 years after leaving office, could have addressed double dipping by office holders by requiring disclosure on personal financial statements of service retirement annuities, and could have required elected officials to provide greater detail regarding their financial interests when submitting their personal financial statements. But the leadership in this state has seen enormous benefit in keeping the public in the dark, closing the doors to process, stifling public input, and dodging tough questions. We need only think about the veto of the dark money bill to understand that that's the case. And these leaders have continued to do this because they believe there is no one that will be holding them accountable, particularly when it comes to the ballot box. As we saw most recently, decisions that keep the public in the dark and outside the pale of public scrutiny cannot be relied on to best serve the interests of the people. But there was some good news in the 83rd legislative session, which ended with more openness and transparency than we began in January. I am proud to have worked closely with my colleagues in the legislature to increase transparency and shed light in some corners of state government that had been dark for too long. We stepped into the 21st century, acknowledged that technology should work to strengthen public trust by making information easier and faster to access, and we made law that public business conducted on private instruments, such as computers and cell phones, is still public business and must be made available to the public if the content relates to work done in that context. Our honoree earlier today, Representative Todd Hunter, authored a bill, as you know, to apply the Texas Public Information Act to electronic devices. Laws, of course, need to reflect the societies that they govern, and updating the statute to reflect current technologies was vital to assuring a functioning democratic system. In addition to the transparency requirements added to CPRIT, I'm also very proud to have worked with our Chair of Economic Development, a committee that I served on, to pass legislation that requires the state auditor to conduct the first ever audit of the Texas Enterprise Fund. This fund, which has provided over $485 million in grants since 2003, represents the largest deal closing fund of its kind in the country, and it's time we understand exactly what it's been doing. I know many of you in this room want the public to have better access to the types and scope of third-party contracts entered into by the state government. We achieved notable success in that regard this session. We worked to ensure contracts like the massive one held by Pearson to test our school children will now be subject to our state's sunset review process and measured for effectiveness. I was also pleased to work with Senator Rodney Ellis in passing legislation that would require third-party vendors, when drafting contracts with state government, to abide by public information disclosure laws when they are performing and acting in the role of state government. During the regular session, these were important victories for open government, made in a bipartisan way, despite some efforts to keep those doors closed. And then, of course, came the first called special session. On the night of the filibuster that session, we saw something that many of us have never seen. That night, after observing the rules of decorum in the Texas Senate and sitting quietly in the gallery throughout the day and night, people stepped up to reclaim their lives, their freedoms, their rights, when they saw that they were being taken away. As the filibuster continued and leadership attempted to short-circuit the rules and traditions of the Texas Senate, the people themselves stood to take back their government, take back their voice. As journalists covering the events of that night and the weeks of stories that followed and indeed still continue today, you had and you stepped up to an obligation to report the truth. A leadership who is accustomed to feeding contrived stories, quotes, and messages to news outlets found themselves without a curtain to hide behind or a machine to spin the mockery being made of the democratic process that occurred that day and night. For the people who couldn't be there that night or didn't get to watch the live stream video, your coverage and your stories kept them updated and aware of the abuse of power that was being perpetuated by a leadership running roughshod over the rights and freedoms of Texans. It was raw and it was real, and there was simply nowhere for them to hide. Frequently now, when I'm out doing errands or out to eat at a restaurant, people, oftentimes mostly younger women, come up to me and introduce themselves. In part, they want to express their concern about the trend against women's rights and personal decision-making and autonomy on healthcare decisions. But mostly, they want to tell me that recent events have encouraged them and their friends to become more active in their democracy. These women and other members of the public have been energized by the events of the past few months. And whether we realize it or not, that energy truly is in large part because they're informed and have had access to accurate and fair reporting. They've had access to reporting that told the whole story, the good, the bad, and the ugly. As much as they refer to the filibuster as the reason for their activism, what has kept them going is an informed press that's smart enough savvy enough, tenacious enough, and committed enough to get the truth and get it to the public. While we still have a tremendous amount of work to do in Texas, I am very proud of our state and proud of the direction we are now moving. With each new voice, each new participant in our democratic system, each new citizen who casts their first vote, and each Texan who sees promise in their government, our democracy grows stronger. I am confident that the energy and enthusiasm currently carrying our state forward will continue to grow. And as participation in our democracy increases, so will the inevitable improvements to the transparency and accountability that are vital to ensuring that state leaders represent the interests of all Texans, not just a powerful few. And with that increased public interest, the value of good, aggressive, responsible reporting becomes even greater. The work you do may at times seem thankless, and I know it must be tremendously hard. But I can assure you, it will always be appreciated by those who realize the value you bring to our government and to our state. Thank you so much for your outstanding work in making sure that the doors of government remain open for all to see. Thank you very, very much.
Take a few questions.
Oh, thank you. That's so nice. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. That's really very nice. Thank you. So now I'm going to do what most elected officials are terrified of doing. I'm going to open this up for questions to a room full of journalists and take 3 or 4 of your questions. So hit me. Yes.
When's the decision going to come about the governor's race?
In just the next couple of weeks. That's all you got? Come on, I know you got more than that.
What will it be?
You'll know in a couple of weeks. Thank you. All right, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me.